Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the velvet dark corners of Tenochtitlán, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and straight into the palace of the emperor himself. And before you get too cozy with the idea, just remember if you were actually here, you probably wouldn't survive this little field trip. Between the strict palace codes, the suspicious guards, and the fact that you're not exactly royalty, you'd last about 3 seconds before being tossed into a dungeon or onto a sacrificial stone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'm curious, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there? I always imagine these bedtime stories rippling out across the world like tiny candles in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slip into the palace courtyard at twilight, a place buzzing with muted gossip, the smell of flowers, and a kind of tension that comes only when hundreds of people know each other's secrets but pretend not to. In the Emperor's court, whispers are currency. Who visited which chamber last night? Who's expecting a child? Who got caught where they weren't supposed to be? These whispers float between servants, guards, and ladies-in-waiting, never loud enough to echo through the stone halls, but always sharp enough to cut. The palace itself is massive, more like a city within the city. Imagine sprawling rooms, decorated with colourful murals of gods and warriors, long reed mats spread across the floors, and chambers where incense curls lazily in the air. Every corridor has its own guards, and every chamber has its own set of rules. But underneath the strict order, there's an undeniable pulse, a heartbeat of desire, alliances, and sometimes scandal. For Aztec royalty, intimacy wasn't just private entertainment or mums, it was tied to politics, religion, and even the survival of the empire. Now, let's pause for a quick reality check. In the Aztec world, marriage and sex were not seen as purely personal choices. They were about power, honour, and cosmic balance. An emperor's lovers weren't just lovers, they were pawns, prizes, sometimes even symbols of divine favour. This meant that every rumour, whether true or invented, could shift someone's fortune in an instant. Imagine being a concubine who catches the emperor's eye. Suddenly, your family gains prestige, maybe even land or titles. But if someone else whispered that you broke palace rules, the punishment could be brutal, even fatal. That kind of high-stakes atmosphere makes modern dating drama look like kindergarten. One historical fact that sets the stage: Moctezuma II, the emperor the Spanish encountered, is said to have had hundreds of women in his household, some wives, others concubines. The number varies depending on which chronicler you believe, but the point is clear. This wasn't just about desire, it was about building a network of loyalties. Each woman often represented an alliance with another noble family, and her presence in the palace was a reminder of political ties. So the palace was less like a harem in the Hollywood sense, and more like a chessboard, where every move mattered. Here's the quirky tidbit. Despite the grandeur of royal intimacy, Aztecs were surprisingly strict about modesty in public. Young men and women were expected to be reserved, and open displays of affection were frowned upon. So you have this fascinating contradiction. Inside the palace, passion, politics, and sex overlapped constantly. But outside in public life, restraint was the law of the land. Imagine if your boss expected you to be celibate in the office. But then at the company retreat, they expected you to marry someone for corporate strategy. That's kind of the vibe. Of course, scholars debate just how much of the gossip we hear about Aztec royalty is real, and how much is Spanish exaggeration. After all, the conquistadors loved to paint the Aztecs as decadent and immoral to justify their conquest. Were the stories of endless harems and shocking rituals accurate? Or were they twisted accounts meant to scandalise European audiences? That's one of the biggest open debates in Aztec studies, separating the reality of intimate royal practices from the propaganda written by outsiders. As you drift further through the palace, you notice how carefully everything is structured. There are sections reserved for noble wives, others for concubines, and still others for attendants and eunuchs who serve as guards. The women live in courtyards filled with flowers and fountains, but also with invisible chains of expectation. Each step, each glance could mean advancement or downfall, and all the while the emperor moves through this world like a god among mortals, his presence shaping everyone's fate. Now picture the gossip spreading in these chambers. You might hear that one concubine is favoured tonight because her family just secured a military victory, or maybe another, is ignored because her brother failed in battle. The bedroom in this palace was a political theatre, and the actors had no choice but to play their roles. That constant undercurrent of tension, desire wrapped in duty, passion colliding with politics, turns every whispered rumour into something potentially explosive. And as you settle back, listening to the hum of this place, you realise you're standing on the threshold of a story that isn't just about sex, but about power, survival, and the strange ways humans have always mixed intimacy with ambition. The palace walls seem to lean in, holding secrets from centuries ago, waiting for you to listen carefully as the tale unfolds. You wander deeper into the palace and the air grows heavier, as though the very stones know the secrets they're keeping. Tonight's whispers shift toward the emperor's marriages, and here's the truth. Polygamy was not only allowed for the Aztec elite, it was expected. One wife would never be enough for an emperor trying to stitch together an empire made of dozens of city-states and rival noble families. Every marriage was a strategic move, like laying down chess pieces made of flesh and blood. You catch the faint laughter of women echoing down a corridor, followed by the shuffle of attendants carrying baskets of food and flowers. Behind those walls sit women from across the empire, daughters of allied rulers, noble women chosen for their beauty or lineage, and even women gifted as part of tribute. Each one adds another thread to the emperor's web of alliances. And here's the thing, these women weren't just ornaments, their very presence was political insurance. To betray or neglect a wife's family could mean rebellion. To favour her could mean loyalty. The emperor's household then was less about lust and more about holding the empire together with silk cords of marriage. The historical fact is striking. Moctezuma X had so many wives and concubines that chroniclers struggled to count them. Some records say he kept more than 150, others suggest it may have been over 400. Imagine being one man in a palace with hundreds of women, each linked to powerful families, each watching for signs of attention. It's not exactly the fantasy some people might picture, it's more like living in a constant political storm where your bed becomes the empire's throne room. But let's add a twist of the unusual. There's an account, likely exaggerated but too juicy not to mention, that Moctezuma would rotate his partners with an almost bureaucratic precision. Women were supposedly assigned to him on certain nights, organised like appointments in a royal schedule. Picture a chalkboard with names scribbled on it. Monday, Lady Xochitl, Tuesday, Lady Tecuani, Wednesday, rest day. It's hard not to chuckle imagining the emperor's attendants managing intimacy like they're running HR. Of course, whether this was true or just Spanish imagination is up for debate, but it shows how even love could become administrative in the Aztec world. The scholarly debate here is juicy. Did Aztec emperors actually practice this massive-scale polygamy? Or did Spanish chroniclers inflate the numbers to paint them as excessive? Some anthropologists argue that the scale was exaggerated because it played into European stereotypes of exotic rulers. Others suggest that the logistics, food, housing, security, proves such harems must have existed. After all, the Aztec Empire was wealthy and organised enough to support enormous households. The truth is likely somewhere in between, with the numbers smaller than legend, but still impressive enough to shock outsiders. You pause by a doorway draped with woven mats, peeking inside at a courtyard glowing with torchlight. Noble women recline on reed mats, dressed in colourful huipils embroidered with turquoise and gold. Servants braid their hair or paint their lips with cochineal dye, while musicians pluck at shell instruments in the background. It looks almost idyllic until you notice the guarded expressions. Each woman knows she is not just here to be adored, but to serve as her family's ambassador. Every smile, every glance is measured, because to misstep could mean disgrace, or worse. And that's where the tension lies. For the emperor, pleasure was bound tightly to politics. For the wives, intimacy was a test of loyalty. And for the concubines, every night could be an audition for survival. Behind the laughter and perfume, you can almost hear the grinding gears of strategy. Imagine lying awake at night, knowing your position in the palace depended not just on beauty or charm, but on your family's performance in war, tribute, and politics. It makes the idea of royal romance feel like a chess match where every pawn bleeds. Now, here's a quirky little scene to picture. At feasts, when wives and concubines gathered with the emperor, servants carried trays of cacao drinks flavoured with chili and honey, thought to be aphrodisiacs. Guests sipped from painted gourds while watching dancers in feathered costumes. The emperor, seated at the centre, radiated calm authority. But beneath the formality, everyone was reading the subtext. Who sat closest to him? Which wife got the most attention? Whose family would rise or fall based on a single glance? That's the silent language of polygamy in the palace. As you linger in the shadows of the courtyard, the music drifts like smoke. And you realise this isn't just a household, it's a living map of the empire. Each woman representing a territory, a city, a promise. To an outsider it may look like indulgence, but to the Aztecs it was governance. Marriage was politics, concubinage was diplomacy, and the royal bed was a council chamber draped in silk and guarded by silence. And so the whispers continue, circling the palace like restless birds. Which wife has fallen in favour? Which alliance is trembling? Which chamber door might open tonight? The air is thick with incense, perfume, and tension, and you're only just beginning to understand how intimacy shaped the Empire's destiny. You slip past another series of chambers, your bare feet brushing against cool stone, and suddenly you're standing at the threshold of the royal women's quarters. Tonight the whispers aren't about how many wives the Emperor collected, but about how those wives were arranged, ranked, regulated, and carefully divided. In the Aztec royal household, not all marriages were equal. The very first wife, usually chosen from the highest-ranking noble family, held the crown among the women. She wasn't just the emperor's partner, she was the queen, the matron, the enforcer of order among the others. Imagine being the first wife and having to share your husband with 100 other women, yet still keeping enough authority to make them all fall in line. The hierarchy was both fascinating and brutal. The first wife had her privileges the others couldn't touch, ritual honours, special seats at feasts, and her children often being first in line for succession. Below her were other noble wives, each representing powerful clans or allied rulers. Then came the secondary wives, often tied to tribute obligations, and finally, the concubines, who sometimes arrived as gifts or spoils of war. You can almost hear the shuffle of embroidered skirts as women navigated this ladder, careful not to step out of line. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a hive buzzing with ambition, jealousy, and alliances. Here's the historical fact. Aztec society was built on the principle of order. Everything had its place. Marriages mirrored the same cosmic balance they saw in the heavens. The sun had its rank, the moon had hers, and the stars knew where they belonged. In the palace, the Queen Mother was the moon, steady and luminous, while the other wives glittered like constellations around her. Even the emperor, for all his authority, needed this structure to maintain legitimacy. If he ignored the hierarchy, chaos could ripple through the court like a cracked obsidian blade. Now, let's sprinkle in something more unusual. Some Spanish chroniclers whispered about the Queen Mother using secret gestures to control the younger wives, tiny movements of her fan or tilts of her head that signalled when someone had spoken out of turn. Imagine sitting in a lavish courtyard, trying to enjoy your cacao, when you see the Queen slowly fold her fan and realise you've just been warned. It sounds almost comical, like a high school queen bee with a silent language of eyebrow raises. But in a world where disobedience could cost your life, every gesture mattered. Of course, scholars debate how much actual authority the first wife had. Some argue she was more of a figurehead, respected but largely symbolic, while others believe she actively commanded the household like a general directing troops. Did she really discipline concubines? Or was that the job of attendants and eunuchs? The lack of direct Aztec voices, most of what we know comes from Spanish writers, means we're piecing together the puzzle with missing parts. Still, whether she ruled by fear, respect, or a mixture of both, one thing is clear, her presence kept the palace's fragile order intact. As you step farther into the women's quarters, the sensory details pull you in. The faint perfume of flowers drifts from a garden at the centre, where night-blooming jasmine glows like ghostly stars. Torchlight flickers against murals of gods and goddesses, their painted eyes watching the women with eternal judgment. On reed mats, wives and concubines sit in circles, weaving cloth or braiding each other's hair, while their attendants hover like shadows. The atmosphere is outwardly calm, but beneath the chatter lies tension. Every glance is calculated, every laugh weighed for its intent. You can feel the unspoken rivalries humming in the air like a taut string. And here's where the quirky fact meets reality. In some accounts, Moctezuma II actually built separate quarters for different groups of women to avoid constant fights. Think of it as a royal dorm system, nobles in one hall, concubines in another, captives tucked away in yet another corner. Despite these divisions, jealousy still leaked through the walls like smoke. Servants, those ever-watchful eyes of the palace, carried tales from one courtyard to the next. A careless word in one chamber could explode in another, setting off a chain of grudges. In some ways, the Emperor's harem wasn't far off from a modern reality show. Plenty of alliances, backstabbing and carefully staged drama, but with much higher stakes. You pause to imagine the life of one concubine, perhaps a young woman from a conquered city, suddenly thrust into this world. She sits quietly in the corner, her clothing marking her as lower in rank, while noble wives whisper nearby. She knows she can't compete with their lineage, but maybe she has beauty or charm that catches the Emperor's attention. For a moment she glances at the Queen's stern gaze, and the message is clear. Rise too quickly and you'll be reminded of your place. The palace hierarchy isn't just an abstract idea, it's written in every interaction, every tense silence. And so the system endures, keeping hundreds of women in uneasy balance. For the Emperor, it's a carefully managed pyramid of loyalty. For the first wife, it's a constant balancing act of authority and diplomacy. For the others, it's a game of survival played under the glow of torches and the scrutiny of the gods. You can almost hear the walls sigh with the weight of so many rivalries and ambitions packed inside. You drift down another hallway, its walls lined with woven mats and painted shields, and the whispers turn darker. Up to now, you've seen polygamy as politics and the ranking of royal wives like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. But behind the neat structure of the palace lurked a dangerous reality: forbidden dalliances. For Aztec princes and princesses, stepping outside approved partners wasn't just risky, it could mean humiliation, punishment, or death. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of alluring, ambitious people and knowing that one wrong flirtation could end your life. The royal family lived under constant surveillance. Guards, attendants, eunuchs, even the servants delivering food acted as watchful eyes. If a princess looked too long at a warrior, tongues wagged. If a prince disappeared for a few hours without explanation, rumours flew. In a palace where every whisper mattered, love was a dangerous luxury. Some young nobles, of course, tried anyway, because that's what young people do, and that's where the real drama unfolded. The historical fact is blunt. Aztec law punished adultery harshly, especially among the nobility. For the commoners, punishment could mean public humiliation or enslavement. For nobles, it could mean execution, because their actions weren't just personal, they reflected on entire dynasties. Chronicles describe adulterers stoned to death, strangled, or publicly shamed. One particularly grim tale tells of noble women caught with lovers being forced to parade through the streets before facing their fate. In a society obsessed with honour, nothing was more scandalous than betrayal. And here's the quirky twist. Despite the harsh laws, there are rumours that secret trysts did happen, often facilitated by sympathetic servants or bribed guards. Imagine a lovesick princess slipping notes hidden in woven baskets of flowers, or a prince sneaking across courtyards under cover of night, his sandals muffled by mats laid on the floor. Sounds almost like a teenage romance novel, except here the stakes are fatal. Some stories even hint that musicians or poets were used as go-betweens, carrying coded verses back and forth. If true, the palace wasn't just a political hive, it was also a maze of secret corridors echoing with heartbeats and reckless ambition. But here's the scholarly debate. Did these forbidden affairs actually happen often? Or were they rare exceptions blown up by chroniclers into moral tales? Spanish writers loved a scandal and often described Aztec nobles as hopelessly lustful to justify their conquest. Some modern historians argue the strict surveillance of the palace would have made affairs nearly impossible, while others counter that in any system this large, cracks always appear. After all, humans have a remarkable talent for finding loopholes when it comes to desire. The truth probably lies in between. Most nobles towed the line, but every so often, someone gambled everything for passion. As you imagine this world, the sensory details sharpen. A torch sputters in the hall, casting long shadows. Somewhere a flute plays a low, mournful tune, masking the sound of footsteps sneaking past. The smell of copal incense clings to the air, but beneath it you sense something more human. Nervous sweat, pounding blood, the thrill of secrecy. You can almost see two lovers meeting in a hidden garden, surrounded by night-blooming flowers, their voices hushed but urgent. For a fleeting moment, love feels worth the risk, even though doom lurks just beyond the courtyard walls. Now, picture the fallout when someone got caught. A princess might find herself banished to a convent-like temple, her hair cut short as a mark of shame. A prince might be stripped of his titles and forced into exile. Servants who aided them could lose their lives, and all the while gossip would race through the palace like wildfire. By dawn, everyone would know the story, embroidered with more detail than reality. That's the thing about whispers. They always grow louder when forbidden love is involved. Here's the fringe fact that adds a strange flavour. Some sources suggest that in certain ceremonial contexts, nobles were actually allowed temporary lovers during fertility rituals, provided priests approved it. So the line between forbidden and sacred was blurry. Imagine the confusion. On one night, intimacy could be holy and cosmic. On another, it could be deadly sin. That contradiction probably kept palace gossips very busy. And so, as you linger in this hallway of shadows, you realise how precarious love was in the Aztec palace. Every stolen glance carried the weight of family honour. Every risk was a gamble with destiny. For the royals, passion wasn't just a feeling. It was a dangerous fire that could warm or destroy depending on who was watching. You follow the trail of whispers into a courtyard where lanterns glow softly, their light reflecting off polished stone basins of water. The talk here isn't about secret affairs, but about the presentation of brides, virgin brides, to be precise. For the Aztec nobility, purity wasn't just a romantic ideal, it was a political necessity. Families offered their daughters untouched as proof of honour, as if their bodies were receipts of loyalty. It sounds harsh, but in this world, virginity was currency, and everyone knew the price. Imagine the moment. A young noblewoman, maybe 14 or 15, prepared for marriage into the emperor's household. She's bathed with herbs, her hair braided in elaborate coils, her skin rubbed with fragrant oils. Attendants dress her in spotless white garments woven with feathers and lined with jewels. To the outside eye, it's a vision of elegance, but to the families involved, it's a contract sealed with her body. If she weren't a virgin, the shame could unravel alliances and disgrace her bloodline. Here's the hard historical fact. Aztec codices and Spanish accounts both emphasize the importance of virginity at marriage for noble women. If a bride was discovered not to be a virgin, her family risked losing political standing or being punished by law. This wasn't just a matter of reputation, it was woven into the system of alliances that held the empire together. A king marrying a dishonoured woman was like forging a weapon out of clay. It would crumble in his hand, but here's where things get quirky. Some sources suggest that the proof of virginity was staged or even faked. Attendants supposedly prepared beds with special cloths to display blood. And if nature didn't cooperate, other methods, like cutting a finger, were used to simulate the evidence. It's a bizarre detail, but it shows how even sacred ideals could be bent when political stakes were on the line. Imagine the tension in a bridal chamber, attendants waiting outside for a sign of success, and someone resorting to creative solutions just to save face. Scholars still debate how rigidly enforced these virginity expectations were. Some argue that they were strict and absolute, part of the larger framework of Aztec honour. Others suggest that while the rules were rigid on paper, in practice families found loopholes to preserve appearances. After all, the line between sacred purity and political convenience was often blurry in Aztec society. The uncertainty itself is telling. It reminds us that behind every rule, there's always someone bending it. You can almost hear the ceremonial process unfold. Priests chant prayers to the goddess Xochiquetzal, patroness of love and beauty, asking her to bless the union. Musicians pluck soft notes from bone flutes while incense fills the air. The bride, eyes lowered, is led into the chamber where the emperor or noble groom waits. Outside, the court holds its breath, waiting for the outcome that will determine whether honour has been preserved or shattered. And imagine the pressure on the young bride herself, raised in a household where her body is seen as her family's honour. She knows this isn't just her wedding night. It's a performance for the empire. Her nerves must have been like taut cords, strung tighter than any drum in the palace. In that moment, love, fear and duty blur into one overwhelming sensation. Now here's the fringe fact that edges into legend. Some chroniclers claimed that certain brides weren't offered directly to the emperor at all, but first underwent purification rituals involving priests or symbolic unions with idols. Whether true or not, the idea reflects how intimacy was wrapped in layers of cosmic meaning. It wasn't enough just to be a virgin bride. She had to embody sacred order, aligning human relationships with divine expectations. As you wander back into the courtyard, the whispers grow again. Servants exchange knowing looks, wives trade subtle remarks, and eunuchs stand silently at their posts guarding doors that hide the empire's most fragile contracts. You realise the palace isn't just full of marriages, it's full of performances, each one staged for gods, families, and politics alike. The image of the virgin bride isn't just about purity, it's about control. And the Aztecs perfected the art of turning bodies into symbols of power. You slip into another wing of the palace, this one quieter, though the silence feels heavy rather than peaceful. Here live the cloistered concubines, women tucked away behind guarded gates, their world reduced to courtyards, chambers, and the endless wait for the emperor's call. The palace is loud elsewhere, markets buzzing, priests chanting, warriors clashing shields, but here the noise softens to the swish of skirts and the low hum of whispered conversations. These women are the unseen gears of royal life, hidden yet vital, like a shadow court existing within the palace walls. The historical fact is striking. Chroniclers describe Moctezuma Ii's concubines as numbering in the hundreds, kept in special compounds separate from his wives. Each group had its own attendants, cooks, and guards. They weren't free to wander the city, or even most of the palace. They were cloistered like precious treasures. To outsiders, this might look like luxury. Rooms decorated with colourful mats, gardens tended by servants, feasts of maize cakes and cacao drinks, but the reality was more like gilded confinement. They lived with comfort, yes, but without freedom. Now here's the quirky twist. Some reports claim these concubines were trained almost like courtiers, taught to sing, dance, and even play games to entertain the emperor. Imagine rows of women practicing songs in Nahuatl, their voices blending into haunting harmonies while guards stood watch. It turns the compound into something halfway between a convent and a performing arts academy, where beauty and talent were honed like weapons. For the emperor, this meant every night wasn't just about desire, it could feel like attending a private festival curated just for him. But scholars debate whether this harem resembled what the Spanish described, or if their accounts were shaped by their own biases. Did Moctezuma really maintain hundreds of cloistered concubines, or did the Spaniards exaggerate to make him seem decadent and corrupt? Some argue that while polygamy and concubinage were real, the scale was inflated to scandalise European audiences. Others suggest the palace was indeed vast enough to house such numbers, making it plausible. The debate still hums in academic circles, because separating fact from propaganda is notoriously tricky when it comes to Aztec sexuality. You take in the atmosphere of the cloister. Courtyards bloom with flowers, but the gates remain shut tight. Inside the walls, women embroider textiles with feathers, braid each other's hair, and pass the time with stories. Yet beneath the calm lies tension. Every concubine knows she's one of hundreds, and her chances of catching the emperor's attention depend on charm, wit, or luck. Imagine the weight of that pressure, living in a confined space, always aware that a single glance from the emperor could change your life, but that months or even years might pass without being chosen. And then there's the question of survival. Some concubines bore children, which elevated their status. Others faded into obscurity, remembered only by their families. For a few, the cloister might have felt like protection, removed from the chaos of the outside world, fed, clothed. And say, for others, it was a golden prison where the air smelled of flowers but the horizon was forever blocked by the walls. Here's a fringe fact that adds spice. Some sources hint that eunuchs, or men rendered incapable of desire, were stationed to guard these compounds. They had one job, to make sure the emperor's concubines remained untouched by anyone else. The presence of these figures adds a strange theatricality to the setting. Imagine a courtyard full of beautiful women, watched over by solemn figures whose entire existence is about preventing scandal. It's like a play staged endlessly day after day with no audience but the emperor. You sit for a while listening to the murmurs of the cloister. The sound of laughter drifts through, mixed with the rustle of woven skirts. Yet the laughter is tinged with restlessness, as if the women know their beauty is wasting away, while they wait for a moment that may never come. And that's the tragedy of the cloistered concubines. They live surrounded by abundance, yet starve for freedom. As you finally leave the compound, you glance back at the guarded gates. The women behind them remain invisible to the world, yet their presence shapes the empire in unseen ways. The emperor's harem isn't just about pleasure, it's about politics, control, and the strange economy of desire. In this palace, even silence is heavy with meaning, and even waiting becomes a form of power. You move deeper into the palace, past a hall where murals show gods descending from the heavens, and you arrive at a chamber thick with incense. Tonight's whispers circle around something stranger than daily politics, the rituals tied to royal marriages, ceremonies where consummation itself became a sacred act. To us, a wedding night might be private, tucked away behind locked doors. In the Aztec world, however, intimacy between royals was bound up with fertility, cosmic balance, and the gaze of the gods. Even the first moment of union carried ceremonial weight, like planting a seed not just for a family, but for the empire itself. The historical fact is this: Aztec marriage ceremonies often included rituals that emphasized fertility and cosmic order. The couple might be tied together with the corner of a cloak, symbolizing unity, or sprinkled with maize kernels to invoke abundance. Among royalty, these rituals could stretch into elaborate displays where consummation was treated as the final step in aligning the couple with the divine. It wasn't just about starting a marriage, it was about feeding the universe itself, ensuring crops would grow and the sun would rise. Now, here's the quirky detail that makes modern ears twitch. Some reports suggest attendants actually waited outside the chamber to confirm the marriage had been consummated. Imagine being newlywed, nervous enough as it is, while half the palace strains their ears outside your door for confirmation. In some versions, a symbolic cloth was displayed afterward, proof that the union had been physically sealed. Whether this was common practice or more of a Spanish invention, it paints a vivid picture of how private intimacy could be turned into public ritual. Scholars debate just how theatrical these consummations were. Some argue that stories of attendants listening in are exaggerated, crafted by conquistadors to depict Aztecs as bizarre and intrusive. Others suggest the practice may have happened, at least symbolically, since other Mesoamerican cultures tied sexual union to public fertility rites. The uncertainty lingers, but it's safe to say that intimacy in this setting carried layers of expectation that would make any modern newlyweds break into a nervous sweat. You picture the scene, a chamber draped with woven mats, flickering torches casting shadows of gods on the walls. Priests outside chant blessings to Xochipilli, the god of pleasure and music, while inside, the bride and groom face the pressure of carrying an entire dynasty's hopes on their shoulders. The air smells of copal resin and crushed flowers. Outside, nobles murmur, waiting for a sign that the cosmic wheel has been nudged forward by two young bodies. In that moment, what should be tender feels more like theatre, a stage where human flesh plays out divine scripts. Now, here's a fringe fact that adds another layer of strangeness. Some rituals reportedly involve bloodletting before or after the act, with the bride or groom piercing themselves to feed the gods. To the Aztec worldview, blood was life force, and combining blood with intimacy symbolized the merging of life and fertility. Imagine cutting your ear or thigh as part of a wedding night. It's unsettling to us, but to them, it was sacred insurance that the union carried cosmic weight. Pleasure and pain, creation and sacrifice were braided tightly together. And what about the young brides themselves? Many were teenagers, barely into adulthood, suddenly placed in a role of both wife and cosmic guarantor. The pressure must have been overwhelming. The palace may have framed it as divine honour, but for the bride it was also a night of scrutiny and expectation. Every glance, every gesture, was judged not just by her husband, but by the invisible eyes of ancestors and gods. As you step back into the palace halls, the whispers cling to you like smoke. Some servants swear they heard laughter from the chamber, others insist they heard only silence. The truth doesn't matter as much as the perception, because what the court believed about that night could shape alliances, inheritance, and the legitimacy of children yet to be born. The emperor's marriages weren't private affairs, they were public theatre dressed up as sacred ritual. And so the ceremonial declaration wasn't just about consummation. It was a ritualized moment where human intimacy and divine expectation collided, where the bedroom became a stage for gods, and where whispers travelled farther than the walls of the palace. The silence outside the chamber was as charged as the union within, proof that in the Aztec world, nothing as simple as marriage could ever be just about two people. You step into another courtyard, this one ringed with stone altars, its air thick with the metallic scent of blood. The laughter and perfume of the cloistered chambers feel a lifetime away. Here, whispers turn darker, circling around rituals where sexuality and death collided, where blood, lust, and gods wove themselves into the same fabric. In the Aztec world, sacrifice wasn't just about appeasing deities, it was also about feeding them with a life force. And sometimes, woven into the ritual, were undertones of fertility and desire that make the whole scene even more unsettling. The historical fact is chilling. Some festivals combined human sacrifice with fertility rites. During the festival of Tenochtitlan, for example, a young man impersonating the god Tezcatlipoca lived for a year as a walking deity, with women provided to him as companions before he was ceremonially sacrificed. His year-long role included feasting, music, and intimacy. He was treated as divine flesh. When his time ended, he climbed the temple steps, broke his flutes, and surrendered to the blade. The act combined desire and death, presenting life's sweetest pleasures before its most brutal end. Here's the quirky detail. Spanish accounts mention that during some rituals, costumed dancers performed erotic movements to honour fertility gods. Imagine feathered warriors and maidens moving in rhythmic steps that weren't just for entertainment, but symbolic reenactments of divine coupling. To us, it sounds like bawdy pageantry. To the Aztecs, it was sacred choreography meant to stir the cosmos itself. The mingling of sweat, music, and the heavy smell of copal incense made the atmosphere almost theatrical, performance for both human and divine audiences. But scholars debate whether the sexual element of these rituals has been exaggerated. Did the Aztecs truly fold intimacy into sacrifice, or did Spanish chroniclers overlay their own fascination with exotic decadence? Some argue that the rituals were more symbolic than physical, with erotic dances representing fertility rather than actual sexual acts. Others believe that at least some physical intimacy occurred, especially when living god impersonators were treated as embodiments of fertility. The lack of direct Aztec testimony means we're left sorting through fragments, balancing between fact, interpretation, and rumour. You picture one of these ceremonies at dusk. The temple pyramid looms overhead, torches flicker along the steps, and drums beat like a racing heart. A young man, his body painted with black stripes, plays a flute while maidens draped in feathers dance around him. Their movements suggest embrace and release, pursuit and capture, the eternal chase of desire. The crowd watches in reverent silence because they're not seeing humans anymore. They're watching gods reenact the primal acts that sustain the universe. When the flutes snap, the mood shifts, and the figure ascends the steps to his fate. Desire and death blur into a single offering, and then there are the fringe rumours. Accounts that sacrificial victims, especially women chosen for goddesses like Zilinen or Topti, were given nights of indulgence before their deaths. Food, music, sometimes intimacy. Whether these were literal or metaphorical weddings to gods is unclear, but the idea adds an eerie layer that the Aztecs believed the gods demanded not just blood, but also joy, beauty, and even the final echoes of love. Imagine lying in a perfumed chamber, knowing the feast before you is both a gift and a farewell. The sensory contrast is intense. One moment, flowers are scattered across altars, musicians play flutes, and dancers move with sensual grace. The next, obsidian blades flash. Hearts are lifted skyward, and the drums thunder louder. For the Aztecs, this wasn't contradiction, it was continuity. Fertility and sacrifice were two sides of the same cosmic coin. To give life, life had to be taken. To spark desire, blood had to flow. In their eyes, the world survived only because humans staged this endless cycle of passion and death. As you retreat from the courtyard, the imagery lingers. You hear the beat of drums still echoing in your ears, the mingling of laughter and cries, the faint sweetness of flowers overwhelmed by iron. The whispers here don't sound like gossip, they sound like prayers, half spoken and half feared. And you realise that in the Aztec palace, even pleasure was tethered to sacrifice. The gods demanded both, and royalty was expected to deliver, no matter how shocking it might appear to us centuries later. You leave behind the blood-slicked courtyards and walk back into the quieter wings of the palace, where the air feels cooler, almost conspiratorial. The whispers here aren't about cloistered concubines or sacrificial lovers, but about something even more taboo: incestuous rumours. In dynasties across history, rulers often looked inward to keep power consolidated, and the Aztecs may have been no different. The idea of royal blood mixing only with royal blood makes sense politically. Why dilute the divine line of an emperor with the daughter of someone less powerful? But in practice, the whispers of brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, crossing boundaries were enough to set the court buzzing with both fascination and horror. Here's the hard historical fact. Some Aztec rulers did marry close relatives, though incest in their context didn't always mean the same as it does for us. For example, marrying half-sisters or nieces was sometimes politically acceptable because it kept land and titles locked within the family. Spanish chroniclers noted these unions, sometimes in shocked tones, because to European ears they sounded scandalous. But to the Aztecs, it was less about scandal and more about strategy, preserving sacred bloodlines and reinforcing the emperor's divine legitimacy. Now for the quirky angle, there are rumours, never fully confirmed, that some rulers claimed their children were not simply the product of human union, but of divine intervention, basically saying the gods had a hand or something else in the matter. It's almost like the Mesoamerican equivalent of the virgin birth story. Imagine a court where a princess's pregnancy is explained not by her cousin in the next chamber, but by the gods themselves lending favour. It sounds absurd, but in a society where rulers were seen as semi-divine, it was believable enough to keep the gossip from turning deadly. Of course, the scholars fiercely debate whether Aztec incest was widespread or exaggerated by the Spanish to paint the empire as immoral. Some evidence suggests that close relative marriages were rare exceptions, only used when political situations demanded them. Others argue that dynasties across Mesoamerica regularly practiced it to keep royal lines strong, much like the Egyptians or Inca. The debate boils down to fragments of codices and chronicles which leave plenty of room for interpretation, and plenty of room for whispers to grow into legends. Picture this: a young princess walks through the palace garden, her noble lineage making her untouchable to most suitors, but whispers follow her. Will she be given to a cousin? A brother? Attendants glance nervously because the wrong match could ignite both scandal and alliance. At night, the Queen's quarters echo with rumours passed between servants, some true, some invented. In a world where royal intimacy was tied to cosmic order, even the suggestion of incest carried weight. It wasn't just bedroom gossip, it was a question of empire-wide legitimacy. And here's a fringe fact that muddies the water further. Some Aztec myths outright celebrated sibling unions among the gods. The divine couple Ometecuhtli and Omequehuatl, for example, were dual aspects of creation, and often described in ways that blurred lines of kinship. If gods could pair with their own reflections, why not rulers who claim divine ancestry? To us it sounds like blasphemous justification, but in the Aztec worldview, copying divine patterns wasn't scandal, it was alignment with cosmic truth. The sensory details are haunting. Moonlight filters through carved lattice windows, falling across embroidered mats where noble children sleep. Their lineage is marked in every detail: their braided hair, their turquoise jewellery, their titles. Yet whispers coil in the air. Who is their true father? Were their parents too closely related? And do the gods approve, or are storms and earthquakes signs of their disapproval? In this world, nature itself was thought to judge human choices, so even the weather could become commentary on the royal bedchamber. As you step back into the main hall, you feel the tension that incestuous rumours carried. They weren't just about who loved whom, but about whether the empire itself was stable. Every whisper of kinship too close, every sideways glance at a child who looked too much like his uncle, was more than gossip, it was potential political dynamite. The Aztec court thrived on whispers, but some whispers burned hotter than others, and none smouldered more dangerously than those about incest among the royals. You drift through another part of the palace, where the torches are dimmer and the air smells faintly of flowers pressed into garlands. The whispers here don't carry the weight of law or punishment, but something more mystical. Tonight, the palace gossips murmur about the emperor's sacred mistress, a woman elevated above the others, believed to embody the presence of a goddess herself. Among hundreds of wives and concubines, this figure stood apart, wrapped in a shimmering aura of both devotion and danger. The historical fact is that Aztec rulers often selected one or more women to serve as representatives of goddesses, especially in rituals tied to fertility or war. These women weren't just lovers, they were living vessels for divine energy. Chroniclers describe them being adorned in elaborate costumes, sometimes even dressed to resemble specific deities. When they entered the emperor's chambers, it wasn't framed as simple intimacy, it was framed as communion with the gods, a fusion of human flesh and divine power. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim that the emperor treated these sacred mistresses almost like high-ranking officials. They were given attendants, gifts, and even their own apartments within the palace. Imagine being one concubine among hundreds, then suddenly elevated to semi-divine status, showered with turquoise jewellery and feathers. It's like being plucked from obscurity and dropped into a role halfway between lover and high priestess. Of course, that kind of elevation didn't come without risk. The higher you rose, the more people wanted to see you fall. Scholars debate the role of these sacred mistresses. Were they truly considered divine embodiments, or were they symbolic titles exaggerated by Spanish writers eager to paint the Aztecs as blending sex and religion? Some argue these women participated in stage rituals meant to honour goddesses like Xochiquetzal, while others believe they played active roles in ceremonies that blurred the line between intimacy and devotion. The truth likely falls somewhere in the middle, part ritual, part politics, part personal indulgence, all wrapped in divine theatre. You imagine the scene. A chamber lit with soft torches, murals of fertility gods glowing faintly in the flickering light. The mistress enters, dressed in a headdress of hummingbird feathers, her skin painted with sacred symbols. Attendants bow low, whispering prayers. For the emperor, this isn't just a night with a favoured woman, it's a ritualised moment where he plays the role of a god, she the role of a goddess, and their union becomes a microcosm of cosmic creation. The air smells of copal and crushed flowers, and every movement feels heavy with symbolism. Now here's a fringe detail. In some myths, goddesses were notoriously unpredictable, loving one moment, vengeful the next. Some stories claim that sacred mistresses were treated with both reverence and fear, as though the goddess they represented might punish the emperor if he neglected them. It's a chilling thought that intimacy, normally private, could carry the weight of divine wrath. Imagine being the emperor, knowing that if you failed to honour your sacred mistress, famine or disaster might be interpreted as your fault. That's a lot of pressure to bring into the bedroom. The palace gossips feed on this tension. Servants whisper about which woman has been chosen, which goddess she embodies this year, whether she looks radiant or worn. Rival wives eye her with jealousy. Knowing her status eclipses theirs in ways beauty or birth cannot touch. Eunuchs stationed outside her chamber trade quiet jokes, pretending to fear lightning bolts should they even glance the wrong way. The whole palace becomes complicit in her myth, weaving human love into divine drama. As you step back into the torchlit hall, you feel the weight of it. How one woman could embody both desire and deity, both partner and priestess. The sacred mistress wasn't just a lover, she was a mirror of the gods, a reminder that in Aztec royalty, the line between flesh and faith was blurred almost beyond recognition. Every sigh, every touch, every glance could ripple outward, shaping not just palace gossip, but the empire's relationship with its gods. You wander down a narrower hall, its stone walls colder, its corners shadowed by tall figures who don't quite fit the palace's glittering glamour. The whispers here are about the watchers, the eunuchs and attendants who served as gatekeepers to the emperor's most private world. If the wives and concubines were jewels in Moctezuma's crown, these men were the iron clasps that held everything in place. They stood guard over chambers, monitored visits, and ensured that no one, not even a lovesick nobleman or ambitious servant, crossed into forbidden territory. The historical fact is that eunuchs, or men rendered incapable of sexual activity, were employed in the Aztec palace, particularly in the women's quarters. Spanish chroniclers described them as watchmen, who ensured the chastity of concubines and restricted who could approach the royal women. While castration wasn't a widespread Aztec practice in society at large, the palace seems to have been an exception, adopting this role for practical control. Imagine a sprawling household with hundreds of women. Without strict guardians, chaos and scandal would spread like wildfire. Here's the quirky detail. Some of these attendants weren't just guards, but also confidants. Women in the palace sometimes trusted them with secrets, knowing they couldn't act on or exploit intimacy themselves. So you can picture them not only patrolling doorways but also serving as reluctant therapists, listening to whispered frustrations about jealousy, boredom, or fear. It's almost comical, these stone-faced men, sworn to prevent desire, ending up drowning in it secondhand as women poured out confessions. But scholars debate whether the Spaniards misinterpreted these figures. Were they truly eunuchs, or simply celibate attendants, priests, or elderly men considered safe? Some argue that the word eunuch may have been applied too loosely by conquistadors who were eager to find familiar roles in an unfamiliar court. Others maintain that castration did occur, at least selectively, to ensure loyalty and control. The lack of direct Aztec records leaves us guessing, and in that uncertainty, whispers grow louder. Picture a night in the cloistered concubines' quarters. The air is heavy with the perfume of night-blooming flowers. Behind closed doors, women braid hair and whisper gossip, their laughter spilling softly into the corridors. Standing just outside are the watchers, silent and motionless, their obsidian-tipped spears gleaming in torchlight. They hear every giggle, every sigh, yet their faces remain unreadable. One concubine teases, calling out a guard's name, and the hall falls into hushed laughter. The guard shifts but says nothing. His silence is part of the ritual. Now, here's a fringe fact that borders on eerie. Some chroniclers hinted that a few eunuchs took their roles to extremes, punishing women for perceived disobedience by reporting even minor infractions to higher authorities. Their loyalty to the emperor sometimes made them feared more than loved. In this way, they weren't just neutral guardians. They became instruments of discipline, shaping the delicate hierarchy within the women's quarters. To be caught sneaking a glance at a forbidden lover wasn't just dangerous because of the law, it was dangerous because the watchers never missed a detail. The sensory details of their presence are striking. Imagine walking barefoot across cool stone floors at night and feeling those eyes follow you. The torch crackles, shadows sway, but the watchers stand as still as carved statues. For the women inside, it must have been both comforting and suffocating. No intruder could harm them, but neither could they move without being observed. Their world was a cage wrapped in silence, and the watchers were its walls. As you return to the broader hall, the whispers echo in your ears. Some claim the eunuchs were loyal protectors, others that they were spies, and still others that they were tragic figures caught between worlds, close to power, yet never able to taste it. Whatever the truth, their presence shaped palace life in ways that went far beyond guarding doors. They were the silent chorus in the Emperor's theatre of desire, always watching, never speaking, but always holding secrets that could never be told. You drift toward the echoing courtyards of the Kalmakak, the temple schools where young nobles were trained to become priests, warriors, or future leaders. The palace whispers here are not about queens or concubines, but about the shaping of desire itself, adolescent initiations that mix discipline, ritual, and sometimes unsettling lessons about sexuality. In the Aztec world, growing up wasn't just about learning how to fight or farm, it was about learning how to align your body, your impulses, and your destiny with the cosmic order. The historical fact is clear. Boys and girls of noble birth were separated in their education. Boys trained in the Kalmakak under strict priests, learning warfare, religion, and self-denial, while girls were raised in institutions called Cuicacali, or in the homes of elder women, where they were taught weaving, household management, and chastity. Yet woven into these teachings were lessons on sexuality, when it was forbidden, when it was sacred, and when it was demanded by the gods. From a young age, nobles understood that their bodies weren't just private possessions, they were tools of family honour and cosmic duty. Here's the quirky twist. Some reports suggest these schools also staged symbolic rituals of sexual initiation, not in the sense of casual indulgence, but in heavily ritualised forms where older mentors explained the cosmic importance of fertility and warned of the dangers of unrestrained desire. One Spanish friar even complained that young nobles learned songs too obscene for Christian ears as part of their training. Imagine teenagers rehearsing verses that blended poetry, innuendo, and divine imagery, their voices echoing under the watchful gaze of priests. It's like sex ed written by shamans with a flair for performance art. But scholars debate how much of this was real and how much was projection. Were these initiations genuine practices, or were the Spanish scandalized by songs and dances that weren't actually sexual, but simply symbolic of fertility? Some argue the friars exaggerated to paint Aztecs as immoral. Others believe the rituals were genuine but misunderstood, cosmic lessons presented in ways Europeans found indecent. The debate reminds us how cultural lenses can distort what was actually happening in those smoky courtyards centuries ago. Picture the scene. A group of adolescent boys kneel in a circle at dusk, torches flickering against the temple walls. Their teacher, a priest with obsidian earplugs and a stern face, recites a poem that compares desire to Vader. Warming when contained, destructive when unleashed. The boys repeat the lines in unison, their voices rising into the night sky. Later, musicians strike up rhythms, and girls from the Quicker perform dances meant to honour fertility goddesses. To outsiders, the movements might look sensual, but to the Aztecs, they were lessons about cosmic balance, passion harnessed, never wasted. And here's a fringe fact that gives these schools an even stranger edge. Some noble boys were encouraged to practice ritual abstinence for years, while others were supposedly initiated through controlled experiences arranged by elders. One chronicle even hints at older women serving as guides in these ceremonies, though scholars remain deeply divided on whether that actually happened or whether it was a Spanish invention to shock readers. Either way, the whispers of these practices add to the sense that sexuality was never left to chance. It was choreographed and monitored and folded into the Empire's cosmic logic. You feel the weight of these teachings in the air. The smell of incense clings to the courtyards, and the rhythmic pounding of drums seems to echo the heartbeat of a society trying to mould its youth into perfect instruments. The boys and girls here don't just learn arithmetic or history, they learn that their bodies are part of the Empire's machinery, to be guarded, offered or deployed depending on divine command. As you leave the temple schools behind, you carry the sense that growing up in the Aztec world meant living with a constant awareness of your own flesh. For commoners, it was about avoiding temptation. For nobles, it was about preparing to use your body as a weapon, a symbol or a sacrifice. The palace whispers of adolescent initiation remind you that in this empire, even the first stirrings of desire weren't private. They were shaped, judged and directed long before you ever entered a royal chamber. You step into a smaller courtyard where the night sky yawns wide above you, stars scattered like jewels across black velvet. Here, the whispers rise with a different cadence. Less gossip, more reverence. Lovers, it turns out, didn't just sneak glances and risk punishments, they also consulted the heavens. In the Aztec world, sex wasn't only an act of desire or duty, it was scheduled, regulated and blessed or cursed by the cosmos itself. Astrology wasn't just about predicting harvests or battles, it extended right into the bedroom. The historical fact is that the Aztec calendar wasn't a simple grid of days. It was a web of sacred cycles, the 260-day Tonalpohualli for rituals, and the 365 for solar seasons. Every day carried omens, influences, and associations with specific gods. This meant that intimacy, especially for nobles, was often timed according to which day fell under which cosmic forces. A couple might be told, not tonight, because the day belongs to Tezcatlipoca, who brings jealousy, or tonight is under Xochiquetzal, the goddess of beauty, so may your union be blessed. Imagine planning date night with a priest hovering over your shoulder, flipping through a cosmic calendar before giving the green light. Now, for the quirky twist. Some accounts claim that priests even advised couples on positions, timing, and whether pregnancy was likely based on the day's symbolism. It sounds like medieval astrology columns with a much higher level of seriousness. Virgo, don't travel today. Aztec noble, don't get frisky on the day of Tlazolteotl unless you're ready for scandal. Whether these details were exaggerated by the Spanish or not, the image is almost comical. An emperor and his mistress waiting patiently while a priest mutters, "Maybe tomorrow. Tonight the stars are frowning." But scholars debate how far this influence really went. Was astrology strictly enforced in the royal chambers, or was it more of a guideline, like a horoscope you might roll your eyes at but still secretly follow? Some argue that rulers absolutely consulted the calendar before unions, especially when fertility and dynastic succession were at stake. Others believe that while astrology shaped public rituals, private intimacy probably bent the rules more often than not. After all, desire doesn't always check its schedule. The debate remains unresolved, which only adds to the intrigue. You imagine a night in the emperor's chambers. A concubine sits by the window combing her hair in the torchlight, while outside priests gaze at the stars and murmur omens. The air smells of night-blooming jasmine, the hum of crickets mixing with the distant beat of drums. A messenger arrives quietly, bowing low, Delivering the priest's verdict, the heavens are favourable. Relief sweeps through the chamber like a breeze, and suddenly the night belongs not just to two lovers, but to the cosmos itself. Here's a fringe fact to make it stranger. The goddess Tlazolteotl, patroness of both sin and purification, was believed to devour sexual transgressions if people confessed to her. Some stories suggest couples who disobeyed astrological warnings could perform rituals to cleanse their union afterward. Imagine that, a kind of divine get-out-of-jail-free card for cosmic scheduling errors. It gave intimacy a strange rhythm. One night sacred, another night sinful, and always a goddess waiting to reset the balance if things went wrong. The sensory detail of it all is vivid. The flicker of firelight on painted murals of stars, the rustle of reed mats as couples prepared to merge not just with each other, but with the fate of the universe. Even the sound of the priest's voice chanting omens added an eerie intimacy, reminding lovers that their sighs and touches were never private. They were offerings to forces far larger than themselves. As you leave this courtyard, you carry the realization that Aztec intimacy wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated by stars, priests and gods, making every union part of a cosmic ledger. The palace whispers about astrology aren't gossip so much as reminders that even in the most private acts, the universe had the final say. And if you ignored it, the gods, or at least the gossips, were always watching. You follow a winding hall lit with steady torches until you reach another courtyard, this one buzzing with more than just gossip. Here the whispers are about power, not the kind sealed with armies or tribute, but the kind rooted in bodies, wombs, and heirs. Fertility wasn't just personal business in the Aztec palace, it was political theatre. Every pregnancy, every birth, every surviving child was treated as proof that the emperor's virility and the wives' sacred wombs were in harmony with the cosmos. To fail in fertility wasn't a private sorrow, it was a crack in the empire's foundation. The historical fact is clear. Aztec rulers, like many monarchs, were judged by their ability to produce heirs. Moctezuma fathered dozens of children, though only a fraction of them held political weight. Each birth was celebrated with ceremonies, gifts, and offerings to the gods. Fertility was framed as divine approval, proof that the gods favoured the ruler's reign. The Queen Mother's children were especially significant. But even concubines who bore sons could rise in status. In this way, childbirth wasn't just about family, it was about empire-wide legitimacy. Here's the quirky detail. Some accounts say midwives in the palace shouted war cries when noble boys were born, comparing childbirth to battle. A newborn boy was dressed in tiny warrior garb, while girls were wrapped in tools for weaving. Imagine the cacophony in the chamber. A woman still trembling from labour, incense filling the air, attendants ululating like they were on a battlefield. It turned the intimate moment of birth into a spectacle of destiny, as the child's future already carved into cosmic stone before their first breath had fully settled. But scholars debate whether fertility was actually abundant or precarious. Some argue that constant warfare, disease, and the stresses of palace life may have limited successful births, making each healthy child even more prized. Others suggest the large number of reported children shows that fertility was indeed abundant, perhaps exaggerated to reinforce the ruler's masculine image. The truth remains hazy, tangled between reality and the need to project endless virility and divine favour. Picture the sensory storm of a noble birth. The air is thick with copal smoke glowing red under torchlight. Midwives chant invocations to Cihuacoatl, goddess of childbirth, their voices low and steady. The Queen Mother groans, her attendants wiping her forehead with cloth soaked in herbs. At the moment of birth, a sudden cry splits the chamber, followed by a war shout from the midwife that rattles the rafters. Outside, servants rush to spread the news. Another child of the Emperor has entered the world, another symbol that the Empire still rests on steady ground. Now here's the fringe fact. Some chroniclers claimed that fertility rituals included offerings of both food and semen, symbolising the dual seeds of life. While historians debate whether this was literal or metaphorical, the imagery is striking. It suggests that male virility itself was ritually honoured, not just as private proof but as a public sacred force. Imagine the Emperor's potency being celebrated not only in his chamber, but on altars, tied directly to the Empire's prosperity. It blurs the line between personal intimacy and cosmic duty even further. And with fertility came constant tension. Wives and concubines lived in a silent contest, each hoping to bear the son who might become heir. Imagine the guarded glances between women in the palace garden, each wondering whose child would rise highest. For the emperor, it meant every birth carried political consequences. A favoured concubine's son might spark jealousy from the queen's children. A daughter might be seen as a missed opportunity, even though noble daughters were valuable for forging alliances. The palace gossips feasted on it. Whispers of miscarriages, stillbirths, or infertility travelled faster than official announcements. Servants speculated about which wife was blessed, which one was cursed, and whether the gods were smiling or frowning upon the dynasty. Fertility wasn't just biology here. It was a performance played under the gaze of both heaven and earth, with the stakes as high as survival itself. As you step out of the birthing chambers, the echoes stay with you. The cries of infants, the ululations of midwives, the anxious silence of attendants waiting for news. You realise that in the Aztec world, the body was never private, not even in its most intimate functions. Fertility was politics, childbirth was war, and every womb in the palace was a battlefield where the empire's future was fought and won. You wander past the birth chambers, following the echo of drums to a smaller hall glowing with flickering torches. The murals here are startling. Painted figures wearing not only the elaborate feathers and jewels of nobles, but also garments that blur the lines of gender. Men with painted lips, women in warriors' headdresses. The whispers here are laced with both curiosity and unease, because in the Aztec court, cross-dressing wasn't just a joke or rebellion. It was ritual, sometimes infused with sexual undertones, that made it scandalous to outside eyes. The historical fact is that Aztec religious festivals often included role reversals. During certain ceremonies, men dressed as women and women as men to honour gods who embodied duality. The deity Xochipilli, lord of pleasure and song, and the goddess Xochiquetzal, patroness of beauty, both blurred boundaries of desire. Dressing as the opposite gender symbolised transformation, the fluidity of creation, and the belief that male and female forces were inseparable. For royalty, participating in such rituals reinforced their cosmic alignment. They weren't just rulers of people, but imitators of the gods' paradoxes. Now for the quirky twist. Some accounts describe noblemen painting their faces with red pigment, donning skirts, and singing in falsetto voices as part of fertility celebrations. Others mention women strapping on mock weapons, marching like warriors, before returning to their domestic roles the next day. To the Aztecs, this was theatre with spiritual meaning. To the Spaniards, it looked like depravity. Imagine a conquistador stumbling upon a royal court where men in gowns danced with women in armour. The poor friar probably fainted before he had time to write it all down. But scholars debate the extent of sexual undertones in these performances. Were these rituals symbolic, or did they sometimes slip into intimate experimentation? Some argue that the dances, with their suggestive movements and costuming, carried erotic layers understood by the participants. Others say that the cross-dressing described by Spanish writers was exaggerated, mistranslated, or filtered through their obsession with labelling the unfamiliar as sinful. The debate lingers, as always, in the space between ritual, performance, and imagination. Picture the sensory richness of one such festival. A courtyard lit by fire bowls, the air heavy with the scent of pulque and roasted maize. Nobles gather, their laughter mingling with flute music. A prince struts in a flowing skirt, bracelets jingling on his arms, while a noblewoman dons a jaguar helmet, growling playfully at the crowd. The scene is humorous, theatrical, but also charged. The blurring of roles reminds everyone that creation itself comes from duality. The crowd cheers, laughs, and then falls into reverent silence as the dancers bow before an idol of Xochiquetzal. Here's a fringe fact. One Spanish friar wrote in horror that these rituals sometimes ended in carnal confusion, hinting at group indulgences after the dances. Modern scholars remain divided. Was this a moralistic exaggeration, or a glimpse into sexual experimentation sanctioned by ritual? It's impossible to know for sure, but the whisper of possibility still clings to the palace walls. For the Aztecs, the cosmos thrived on duality, transformation, and breaking boundaries. Why wouldn't human bodies sometimes do the same? For the women of the palace, these festivals were double-edged. On one hand, they offered a brief taste of freedom, to march like warriors, to joke openly, to mimic the power of men. On the other, they reminded everyone that once the torches burned low, roles would snap back into place. The laughter and play carried an undercurrent of melancholy, as if the brief moment of reversal only highlighted the rigid hierarchies of daily life. As you leave the hall, the murals seem to follow you, painted faces both male and female, both one and many. The whispers echo, that night when the Emperor himself wore a feathered skirt, that woman who danced with him as a jaguar warrior, the way the crowd gasped and laughed before falling into silence. Cross-dressing in the Aztec court wasn't parody, it was prayer, performance, and perhaps just maybe pleasure. You leave behind the laughter of festivals and step into a quieter passage, one lined with stone carvings of jaguars and eagles. The air here feels land heavier, the whispers sharper. Tonight's talk isn't about wives or sacred mistresses, but about the darker side of intimacy in the royal palace, the use of foreign captives as unwilling participants in royal bedrooms. If marriages forged alliances and concubines embodied loyalty, then captives, plucked from the battlefield, were reminders of conquest. Flesh turned into trophies as trophies of power. The historical fact is that Aztec warfare, the so-called Flower Wars, wasn't just about territory. It was about taking captives, sometimes for sacrifice, sometimes for tribute, sometimes for service in noble households. Among the spoils of war were young men and women, some destined for altars, others for labour, and a select few brought into the palace. Chroniclers note that Moctezuma's household included women from conquered regions, their presence both symbolic and practical. They weren't there by choice, they were there as living emblems of submission, their bodies reminders of the emperor's reach. Here's the quirky angle. Some captives were reportedly paraded in the palace adorned with their homeland's costumes, as though the emperor enjoyed seeing the diversity of his empire reflected in his chambers. Imagine walking into a courtyard where women from distant towns wore embroidered huipils in unfamiliar patterns, their accents betraying their origins. It wasn't just sensual, it was geopolitical theatre. Each captive represented a defeated city, their presence both alluring and humiliating. But scholars debate how much sexual exploitation of captives occurred. Spanish chroniclers, eager to frame the Aztecs as decadent, emphasise the idea of harems stuffed with conquered women. Yet archaeological evidence and indigenous codices often present a more subdued picture, showing captives primarily destined for sacrifice. Did the palace truly maintain a pool of foreign lovers, or was this another layer of colonial exaggeration? The debate persists, with truth likely scattered somewhere between brutality and propaganda. You picture the sensory details of such an encounter. A captive woman, her wrists painted with protective herbs, is escorted into a perfumed chamber. The air smells of copal and crushed flowers, but she carries the dust of battlefields on her skin. Attendant strips away her native garments, replacing them with palace robes, a transformation both physical and symbolic. Outside, whispers ripple among servants. Where is she from? Which battle brought her here? Will she bear a child whose bloodline ties two worlds together? For her, it is a life suspended between survival and despair. Now for the fringe fact. Some sources suggest that captive women who bore children could secure a strange form of integration into palace life. Their offspring, while not considered equal to the queen's, could still be woven into networks of power, sometimes even married off to lesser nobles. This blurred the line between trophy and mother, between spoils of war and matriarch. It also created awkward dynamics within the palace. Imagine a concubine of noble blood sitting across from a captive who, by sheer fate, produced a child favoured by the emperor. The gossip must have been relentless. The emotional landscape here is tense. For the emperor, captives were symbols of dominance, living reminders of his military prowess. For the wives and concubines of noble blood, they were rivals or humiliating presences, proof that even outsiders could intrude on their carefully ranked hierarchies. For the captives themselves, every day was a gamble. One wrong gesture could send them from the perfumed chamber to a sacrificial stone. Desire and danger fused into a single suffocating reality. As you step back into the palace corridors, the whispers don't fade. They grow. Some claim a captive once bewitched the emperor with her beauty, angering the queen. Others insist that children of captives were quietly erased from the genealogies, their names scrubbed from memory. The truth is hard to pin down, but the shadows speak louder than certainty, and in those shadows you sense how the Aztec Empire used every tool at its disposal, alliances, rituals, and even bodies taken from war, to maintain its power. You drift into another hall, This one painted with dazzling murals of gods and goddesses locked in embrace. The air here feels different, not oppressive like the chambers of captives, nor structured like the Queen's court, but theatrical, buzzing with ritual. The whispers tell of divine impersonations, ceremonies where nobles and royals didn't just honour the gods but became their Majorn, performing erotic pageants that blurred the line between human intimacy and divine coupling. In the Aztec world, theatre wasn't entertainment, it was prayer. And sometimes that prayer looks suspiciously like foreplay. The historical fact is that impersonation of gods, known as Ixiptla, was central to Aztec religion. Men and women chosen to embody deities wore elaborate costumes, masks and ornaments, moving, speaking and even eating as though they were the god themselves. These impersonators didn't just play roles, they were temporarily treated as divine, and when the gods they embodied were associated with fertility, love, or creation, the ceremonies often included ritualized intimacy, symbolizing cosmic unions that sustained the universe. Here's the quirky twist. Chroniclers describe nobles dressing as Tlaloc and Chalchiotlik, the rain god and his consort, or Xochiquetzal, goddess of love, engaging in staged embraces during festivals. Imagine a palace courtyard transformed into a cosmic stage, nobles in feathered headdresses, dancers swirling like stars, and in the centre, two figures painted in sacred colours performing a divine romance for an audience of priests and nobles. It was pageantry, performance and theology, all rolled into one. The Spaniards, watching wide-eyed, likely thought it was debauchery, but to the Aztecs it was devotion. But scholars debate how much actual sexual activity occurred in these impersonations. Some argue that the rituals were symbolic, with embraces, dances, and suggestive movements standing in for intimacy. Others insist that in at least some cases, the impersonators consummated their roles, believing their acts directly fed the gods' hunger for balance. Was it theatre, ritual sex, or both? The debate continues, leaving modern historians with tantalising but incomplete glimpses into the palace's most secretive ceremonies. Picture one such performance in the palace at night. The courtyard is strung with garlands of marigolds, their scent thick in the air. Drums thrum like a heartbeat, flutes trill like birds at dawn. The impersonator of Xochiquetzal glides forward, her garments shimmering with hummingbird feathers, her face painted with red dye. Across from her, a noble dressed as Xochipilli steps into the torchlight, his skin glittering with jade dust. Their dance begins slow, hands almost touching, then spirals into something more daring, movements that suggest pursuit, capture, embrace. The crowd watches in reverent silence, not at humans, but at gods reborn in flesh. Now for the fringe fact. Some impersonators of gods lived as their deity for an entire year before the final ritual, indulging in food, music, and even intimacy as if they were divine. At the end, they were sacrificed, their blood sealing the god's temporary presence in the world. Imagine the strangeness of it. Living a year as a deity, sleeping in perfumed chambers, adored by nobles, desired by concubines, only to meet your end at the edge of an obsidian blade. It was both the highest honour and the cruelest fate the Empire could bestow. The sensory richness of these impersonations is overwhelming. Torches blaze, shadows flicker across painted gods on the walls, and the air hums with the tension of hundreds watching two figures act out cosmic passion. The line between performance and reality blurs. Even if the intimacy was only symbolic, the effect on the audience was visceral. They believed they were watching creation itself replayed, the spark that kept the cosmos alive. As you leave the hall, the whispers chase you down the corridors. Some say an impersonator once fell in love with her royal partner, forgetting her role and defying the script. Others murmur that a union blessed under divine impersonation carried more legitimacy than any marriage contract. The truth may be buried under centuries of rumour, but the impression lingers. In the Aztec palace, sex could be theatre could be prayers, and prayer could be indistinguishable from desire. You wander into a chamber alive with laughter and the sour-sweet smell of fermenting agave. Clay vessels line the walls, their rims crusted with froth, and the whispers here are sticky with scandal. Tonight's stories aren't about cosmic impersonations or sacred brides. They're about pulque, the milky alcohol brewed from maguey sap, and how it loosened tongues, bodies, and boundaries. In the Aztec Empire, pulque was sacred, a drink of priests and elders, but it was also forbidden in excess. That made it the perfect ingredient for palace intrigue, intoxicating, scandalous, and utterly irresistible. The historical fact is this: pulque was tightly controlled in Aztec society. Ordinary people could drink it only during festivals, the elderly were allowed it daily, and nobles might sip it ceremonially. But drunkenness was condemned, punishable by humiliation or worse. The rules were strict because intoxication wasn't seen as private, it threatened social order. Yet behind palace doors, pulque flowed more freely. Banquets of nobles often ended with cups of the creamy drink passed around, its buzz mingling with the heat of torches and the rhythm of drums. Here's the quirky detail. Some sources claim that Moctezuma himself rarely drank pulque, preferring cacao flavoured with chili, but his court was another story. Nobles and concubines indulged, and once the drink loosened their restraint, gossip says songs turned bawdy, dances slowed into something more suggestive, and lines between ritual and revel blurred. Imagine a palace courtyard at midnight, nobles swaying in embroidered cloaks, concubines laughing behind painted gourds of pulque, the atmosphere sliding from dignified ceremony into something far more scandalous. But scholars debate the accuracy of these stories. Spanish chroniclers often portrayed Aztecs as drunk with sin to contrast them with supposedly sober Christians. Was pulque truly a cause of royal debauchery, or just another European exaggeration? Archaeological evidence suggests the drink was central to ritual feasts, but whether it led to wild sexual indulgence remains uncertain. Some argue that the strict punishments for drunkenness imply people often broke the rules, while others believe the scandals were mostly propaganda. The truth is tangled in the froth of the maguey. Picture the sensory scene of one such banquet. A circle of nobles lounges on reed mats. Gold jewellery flashing in firelight. Drummers pound a steady rhythm, while flutes pierce the air with high, laughing notes. Clay cups of pulque are passed around, the thick, sour liquid coating tongues. At first, the mood is ceremonial, dignified. But as the cups empty, the laughter grows louder, the dance is bolder. A noble woman stumbles slightly, her hand lingering on the shoulder of a man not her husband. Gasps ripple, but the music drowns them out. Somewhere in the shadows, eunuchs exchange worried glances, knowing scandal is fermenting faster than the drink itself. Here's a fringe fact that adds spice. One colonial-era account insists that certain fertility rituals explicitly involved pulque, with couples drinking it before engaging in sacred intimacy. The drink's hazy warmth was said to please Tlazolteotl, goddess of desire and purification. Whether real or invented, it paints a striking image, lovers raising frothy cups under the goddess's gaze, their blurred boundaries seen not as sin, but as offering. To the Spanish it looked like drunkenness. To the Aztecs, perhaps, it was another way to feed the gods. But indulgence always carried risk. A noble caught drunk at the wrong time could face disgrace or even execution. Servants who drank secretly might be whipped or worse. Yet the temptation remained. The more forbidden the drink, the more alluring it became, especially in the palace, where rules bent in the shadows of power. The whispers you hear are thick with stories. A concubine who spilled her cup and her secrets in the same night, a prince who stumbled into the wrong chamber after too much pulque, a festival where laughter turned to scandal at dawn. As you leave the pulque chamber, the echoes cling to you like the sticky film of the drink itself. You realise that in the Aztec world, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a catalyst. It blurred lines, loosened masks, and left behind whispers the palace would never quite silence. And like every other indulgence here, it sat balanced between sacred ritual and dangerous excess, proof that even the gods enjoyed a little intoxication, so long as mortals knew when to stop. You slip into a hall where the air feels heavier, colder, as if the walls themselves have absorbed centuries of fear. The whispers here aren't playful or scandalous, they're edged with dread. Tonight, the palace gossips murmur about punishments for adultery the brutal methods used to enforce fidelity among nobles. In the Aztec world, intimacy wasn't a private affair, it was bound by law, morality, and the watchful eyes of gods and humans alike. And when someone strayed, the consequences weren't whispered. They were shouted, carved, and sometimes screamed into history. The historical fact is stark. Aztec law treated adultery as a grave offence. For commoners, the punishment might be public humiliation or loss of property. But for nobles, whose unions symbolised alliances and divine order, adultery could mean death. Chronicles describe adulterous couples stoned, strangled, or even executed in front of crowds. Fidelity wasn't just about honour, it was about cosmic stability. A noble's betrayal was seen as a crack in the empire's moral foundation, threatening both family prestige and divine favour. Here's the quirky detail. Some accounts claim that women caught in adultery were forced to parade through the streets with their hair cut short, a visible mark of shame. In a society where hair was a symbol of status and beauty, this was devastating. Imagine walking through Tenochtitlán, once adorned with feathers and jewels, now shorn and jeered at, every glance from neighbours a dagger. For the Aztecs, shame was punishment enough to ripple through generations, but scholars debate how uniformly these punishments were applied. Were nobles really executed for every indiscretion, or were exceptions made for political convenience? Some argue that harsh laws were ideals, meant to scare people into obedience, while in practice the powerful often escaped. Others point to examples where even royal figures were punished, showing that no one was entirely above the law. The uncertainty leaves space for whispers, which executions were real, which were staged, and which were quietly erased from memory. Picture a night when an adulterous couple was caught. Servants whisper, guards storm a chamber, and the guilty are dragged into the courtyard. Torches flare, the crowd gathers, the smell of incense mixes with sweat and fear. Stones are piled, ropes brought forward. The punishment is swift, brutal, and public. Onlookers gasp and murmur, some horrified, others smugly satisfied. For the Emperor, the message is clear. Fidelity is not negotiable. The lovers' screams fade into silence, but the lesson echoes through the palace walls. Now for the fringe fact. Tenochtitlan, the goddess of desire and purification, was believed to consume sins of lust if confessed properly. This suggests an odd contradiction. On one hand, adultery was punishable by death, on the other, there was a divine loophole. If you confessed to the goddess, or to her priests, you might escape punishment, your sin devoured by divine forgiveness. Was this a way out for nobles caught in the act, or simply a spiritual consolation? The tension between law and mercy made adultery even more charged, a gamble with both mortal and divine judges. The palace gossips thrived on these stories. They whispered about which concubine was rumoured to stray, which nobleman risked a glance too long, which punishment might come next. Servants replayed the details like ghost stories, the sound of stones hitting flesh, the sight of a noblewoman's hair falling in clumps, the hush that followed an execution. The fear was contagious, ensuring that even those who never strayed felt the cold breath of caution on their necks. As you walk out of the hall, the shadows feel sharper, the silence heavier. You realise that in the Aztec world, love was never simple. It could elevate a family to glory, but it could also drag them into ruin with terrifying speed. Fidelity wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. And every whispered story of punishment was a reminder that in this palace, passion could be fatal and desire was always dancing on the edge of death. You step into another wing of the palace, where the torches burn lower and the voices are hushed, as though the very walls have agreed to keep secrets. The whispers here aren't about queens or concubines, or even drunken noble caught in scandal. They're about something far more hidden, same-sex liaisons that flickered quietly in the shadows of the Aztec court. In a world where intimacy was wrapped in rules, rituals and politics, desire didn't always follow the prescribed paths. Some nobles found passion in places the law forbade, and the whispers of their encounters cling to the palace like smoke. The historical fact is that Aztec society officially condemned homosexuality, especially among nobles and priests. Chroniclers recorded punishments that ranged from public humiliation to execution, with strict laws meant to deter any deviation from sanctioned unions. For commoners, such acts were treated as moral offences. For nobles, they could be framed as cosmic corruption, threatening the stability of the state. Yet the very harshness of the laws suggests that same-sex relationships existed, otherwise, why legislate them so fiercely? Here's the quirky detail. Some accounts claim that male youths in the Kalmakak, the temple schools, formed intense bonds that may have crossed into the romantic or erotic. Spanish friars, horrified, wrote of sins against nature, discovered among students training for priesthood or military service. Imagine dormitories full of young men, disciplined by day, but sharing whispered confessions and stolen touches by night. To the friars, it was depravity. To the youths, perhaps, it was simply another form of longing in a world that demanded strict abstinence until marriage. But scholars debate whether these accounts reflect reality or colonial projection. Were the Spanish seeing genuine relationships, or imposing their own fears onto unfamiliar cultural practices like close male bonding or ritual embraces? Some anthropologists argue that at least some relationships existed, hidden behind palace walls or cloaked in ritual. Others insist the evidence is too thin, muddied by moral panic. The result is a debate that leaves more questions than answers, echoing the whispers that have never quite faded. Picture the sensory landscape of a secret encounter, a torch guttering low in a deserted corridor. The cool stone floor beneath bare feet. Two young nobles meet in the shadows, their embroidered cloaks brushing against each other. The air smells faintly of copal from a nearby altar, the silence broken only by the distant beat of drums. For them, this moment is both dangerous and intoxicating, a fleeting spark in a world that would snuff it out if discovered. Every breath carries risk, every glance is a gamble, but desire doesn't wait for permission. Now for the fringe fact, in some myths, gods themselves had engaged in acts that blurred sexual norms. Tezcatlipoca, the trickster reed, was sometimes depicted in roles that bent gender and desire. This raises a tantalizing question. If the gods themselves didn't always conform, might their human imitators have followed suit? Perhaps some nobles justified their hidden passions by pointing to divine precedents, whispering, "If the gods can, why not us?" Of course, no one spoke that too loudly. The punishments were too severe. The palace gossips naturally couldn't resist. Whispers of same-sex trysts spread quietly, always with an edge of both fascination and fear. Servants speculated about which princes spent too much time together, which priests lingered too long in each other's company. Nothing could be proven, but the rumours were enough to spark tension. In a world where even glances carried political weight, the suggestion of forbidden love could wound reputations as sharply as an obsidian blade. As you leave the dim corridor, the silence feels thicker than before. You realise that these hidden liaisons, whether real or exaggerated, reveal something universal. Desire never fits neatly into laws or calendars. The Aztec Empire, for all its rules, couldn't entirely contain the pull of human attraction, and so the whispers remain, quiet, dangerous, but impossible to silence completely. In the palace, even shadows had lovers, and the walls themselves seem to remember. You slip into a corridor draped with incense smoke, where priests in long black cloaks move silently, their faces hidden by shadows. The whispers here are softer, almost reverent, but they carry an edge of scandal. These aren't about queens or concubines, but about the men in feathered headdresses and obsidian earplugs, the priests themselves, and whether their closeness to the gods sometimes extended into the emperor's private chambers. In the Aztec world, priests were supposed to embody purity, yet rumour paints a murkier picture, holy men doubling as secret lovers. The historical fact is that Aztec priests lived under vows of discipline. They fasted, bled themselves in rituals, and were expected to abstain from indulgence. Yet, paradoxically, they also played roles in fertility ceremonies, sometimes acting as intermediaries between mortals and deities. This gave them unusual access to both the emperor and his wives. A priest might bless a union, witness a ritual consummation, or guide fertility rites. With such proximity, it's no wonder the gossips of the palace wondered, did these guardians of the divine ever cross the line into intimacy themselves? Here's the quirky detail. Some chroniclers describe priests sleeping in the same quarters as noblewomen, ostensibly to guard or guide them during periods of ritual seclusion. Imagine the tension. Rows of reed mats, flickering torches, and a man sworn to chastity trying not to notice the women he was meant to protect. The Spaniards, scandalised, reported this as evidence of immorality, though it may have been ritual supervision rather than anything overt. Still, where proximity exists, whispers soon follow. But scholars debate whether priestly intimacy was real or exaggerated. Some argue that the Spaniards, already suspicious of any faith not their own, painted the Aztec clergy as hypocrites. Others point to hints in Nahuatl poetry and songs that suggest priests were sometimes caught in lapses of chastity. Could these lapses have included affairs with royal women, or even the emperor himself? The lack of concrete evidence leaves only speculation, but speculation is enough to fuel centuries of intrigue. Picture a scene in the temple courtyard. The emperor kneels before an idol of Tlaloc, raindrops painted on its stone face. A priest leans close, whispering the day's omens, their shoulders brushing in the torchlight. Later, in private, the priest is summoned again, not as a ritual leader, but as a confidant. The chamber smells of copal and sweat. Was the conversation spiritual, political, or something more? No one can say for sure, but the tension between devotion and desire hums like a taut string. Here's a fringe fact. Tlazolteotl, goddess of both lust and purification, was central to confessions. Priests listened to sins and declared them forgiven. Imagine the irony if a priest who absolved sexual sins carried some of his own. The very act of confession blurred boundaries, noble women whispering secrets of forbidden desire into the ears of men who weren't supposed to know such things. Did absolution ever tip into temptation? The possibility alone kept tongues wagging in palace corridors. The palace gossips loved to speculate. Servants whispered that a certain priest lingered too long in the queen's chambers, or that the emperor relied on a particular holy man more than others. Some stories were surely exaggerated, others perhaps grounded in truth. But in a world where priests controlled access to the gods, their proximity to power made them irresistible subjects for rumour. Holiness and scandal are natural bedfellows when watched from the shadows. As you leave the incense-thick hall, you feel the contradictions clinging to you. Priests bound to chastity, yet constantly near temptation. Priests charged with purity, yet accused of secrets. Whether the whispers of intimacy with royalty were fact or fiction, they reveal a truth that transcends cultures. Where power and devotion mingle, desire often finds a way to sneak in. And in the Aztec palace, even the men of the gods weren't entirely safe from gossip's sharp edge. You drift into a quieter wing of the palace where the walls are lined not with shields or murals of battle, but with painted scrolls and reed baskets filled with folded manuscripts. The air here hums with a softer kind of power, the power of words. The whispers in this place aren't about punishments or scandals, but about the poetry of the Aztec court, verses written in Nahuatl that shimmer with double meanings. Outwardly, they praised flowers, music, or the gods, but hidden within were erotic undertones that courtiers traded like secrets. If the palace was a hive of desire and discipline, poetry was its coded language. The historical fact is that Aztec nobles were trained to compose and recite poetry known as in Xochitl and Cuical, flower and song. These verses were performed at feasts and ceremonies accompanied by drums and flutes. Poetry wasn't simply entertainment, it was philosophy, prayer, and politics all at once. Yet among the noble verses about life's brevity and the glory of gods, there were also playful, sensual songs that compared lovers to blossoming flowers, ripe fruit, or the sweet intoxication of cacao. It was a refined way of speaking about passion in a world where direct words might be dangerous. Here's the quirky detail. Some poems were written so metaphorically that only insiders understood their meaning. Imagine a nobleman serenading a woman not with "I love you," but with "My heart opens like the morning flower that drinks the dew." To outsiders, it sounded like harmless nature imagery. To those in the know, it was basically a love letter in disguise. The palace must have thrummed with verses passed in hushed voices, like text messages hidden in petals and rhythms. But scholars debate the extent of eroticism in these poems. Were they genuinely about passion, or are modern readers projecting onto metaphors of flowers and fruit? Some argue that Aztec poetry was deeply symbolic, tied to the fragility of life rather than physical desire. Others counter that fertility and sensuality were inseparable in Mesoamerican thought. So when a poet sang of blossoming flowers, he was also hinting at blossoming love. The ambiguity itself made the verses irresistible, inviting interpretation that blurred art and intimacy. Picture a banquet in the palace courtyard. Nobles recline on reed mats, torches flicker, and musicians strike up a rhythm on drums. A young poet rises, holding a painted gourd of pulque, his voice weaving through the smoke of copal. He sings of hummingbirds sipping nectar, of jade shimmering in sunlight, the flowers trembling in the breeze. The crowd listens, some nodding politely, others smirking because they catch the double meaning. Across the courtyard, a concubine lowers her gaze, hiding a smile. In that moment, poetry becomes both performance and secret message. Now for the fringe fact, one friar complained that some Nahuatl songs were so obscene they could not be repeated. Unfortunately, most of those verses were destroyed or censored, leaving only hints of their existence. Imagine what was lost. Lines that might have captured the raw, playful, or even scandalous side of Aztec court life erased because they offended European sensibilities. What survives is tantalizing, but it's only a fraction of the full poetic landscape that once echoed through the palace. The sensory detail of these performances is vivid. The steady beat of drums underlines every word, the scent of night-blooming flowers drifts through the air, and the audience sways in rhythm, caught between solemn reverence and sly amusement. Poetry gave the nobles a way to express what they couldn't say outright, to turn forbidden feelings into art that no one could outright condemn. In the shadows of rigid laws, verses blossomed like secret gardens tended by those who knew how to listen. As you leave the manuscript-filled chamber, you realise that the whispers of poetry may have been the most enduring love affairs of the Aztec palace. Words, after all, could slip past guards, outlast punishments, and even survive conquest. Where bodies risked death, verses lived on, carrying the hidden sighs of lovers into the future. In the empire of flowers and song, desire always found a voice. You step out of the chamber of poetry and into a quieter hall, where the walls are painted not with battles or flowers, but with the rounded bellies of pregnant women, midwives and gods who oversee birth. The whispers here are not sly or scandalous, they're reverent, tinged with awe and fear. Tonight's murmurs dwell on the mingling of birth, pain and pleasure, how the Aztecs framed childbirth itself as an erotic sacred act, one that placed women at the very heart of cosmic drama. In the palace, the labour of royal wives and concubines wasn't just domestic duty, it was a performance of power. The historical fact is that childbirth in Aztec culture was compared to warfare. Women who died in labour were honoured as fallen warriors, their spirits said to rise alongside the sun. But beyond this martial imagery, birth was also wrapped in sensual language. Some songs and prayers described the moment of delivery as both agony and ecstasy, a paradox that blurred the lines between suffering and desire. The act of bringing life into the world wasn't seen as passive. It was an active, almost erotic struggle that aligned women with the generative powers of the gods. Here's the quirky detail. Midwives often shouted war cries during the moment of birth, especially for boys, as if to announce that a new warrior had entered the world. But at the same time, they recited chants invoking Xochiquetzal and Tlazolteotl, deities of beauty and desire, tying the newborn's arrival to fertility and pleasure. Imagine the sensory clash, a chamber filled with incense smoke, a mother's groans, ululating cries of victory, and prayers that compared her sweat to the dew of dawn. For the Aztecs, even childbirth was a cosmic pageant where pain and passion intertwined. But scholars debate how erotic these birth rituals truly were. Some argue that the sensual imagery in songs and chants was symbolic, reflecting fertility rather than literal pleasure. Others point out that in a society where sexuality and creation were inseparable, it's possible that the language wasn't just metaphor. Did noble women really experience childbirth as both torment and transcendence? Or was the poetry simply a way to dignify suffering? The lack of direct testimony from women themselves leaves us guessing, and that silence only deepens the mystery. Picture the scene in the royal birth chamber. Torches flicker, shadows dancing across painted murals of goddesses with swollen bellies. The Queen Mother, sweating and trembling, clutches woven cloth as midwives encourage her with fierce cries. Around her, attendants scatter flowers, the fragrance almost overpowering the metallic scent of blood. When the baby emerges, the chamber erupts, war shouts from the midwives, prayers rising into the rafters. The new life cradled as both air and cosmic proof. Outside, nobles await news, their hearts pounding with both political calculation and genuine awe. Now for the fringe fact. Some colonial writers hinted that noble births were sometimes dramatised with ritualised touches of intimacy, such as the husband being present to embrace the mother at key moments, reinforcing the union of male and female energies. Whether this was fact, metaphor, or Spanish exaggeration is unclear, but it adds a layer of intimacy to an already charged ritual. It suggests that even in the throes of labour, sexuality and creation were seen as inseparable forces. The sensory details are overwhelming. The heavy perfume of copal resin, the heat of too many bodies crowded in the chamber, the sound of drums outside keeping rhythm with the mother's cries. Every moment is heightened, every movement framed as sacred. The mother herself is both vulnerable and exalted, her body the battlefield on which life emerges, her sweat and blood turned into offerings for gods and ancestors. As you leave the birth chamber, the whispers linger. Some speak of women who survived and were celebrated as victorious warriors. Others murmur of those who died, becoming honoured spirits who raced across the dawn skies. In all cases, childbirth was never merely biological, it was erotic, spiritual and political, an act that bound women's bodies to the fate of the empire itself. You move toward the grandest wing of the palace, where the air itself seems thick with legends. The torches burn brighter here, casting long golden shadows on murals of emperors seated like gods. The whispers in this place are not about servants or concubines, but about the emperors themselves, especially Moctezuma, the most infamous figure in palace gossip. His name clings to stories of excess, desire and scandal that blur the line between fact and rumour. If the Aztec court was a stage, then Moctezuma was both its playwright and its star, his supposed lusts feeding centuries of imagination. The historical fact is that Moctezuma maintained a vast household of wives and concubines, reportedly numbering into the hundreds. Chroniclers describe him living in near isolation, served with meals by dozens of attendants, and surrounded by women chosen from noble and conquered families. His palace was not just a residence, but a city within a city, with entire compounds dedicated to housing his consorts. To outsiders, this looked like indulgence. To Aztecs, it was a physical manifestation of power. The emperor wasn't just a man, he was a nexus of alliances, fertility and divine will. Here's the quirky detail. Spanish accounts claim Moctezuma changed his clothes several times a day, never wearing the same garment twice, and that the discarded robes were given to his concubines or attendants. Imagine closets so enormous they rivaled small villages, each outfit touched once, then passed on like a royal hand-me-down. To the gossips of the court, every garment carried meaning. If a concubine received a robe that smelled faintly of cacao, perhaps the emperor had worn it to a private feast. If another received one damp with perfume, maybe she had been closest to his chambers that night. But scholars debate the truth of Moctezuma's excesses. Was he truly a decadent ruler surrounded by silks and lovers, or was this a Spanish exaggeration to justify conquest? Some historians argue that the image of Moctezuma as a lustful tyrant was crafted to contrast with Christian kingship, making the conquest seem like moral salvation. Others point out that even if the numbers were exaggerated, the palace's size and wealth suggest a lifestyle far beyond ordinary rulers. The truth likely lies between legend and reality, a man both disciplined and indulgent, feared and envied. Picture one of his legendary feasts. The emperor sits on a raised platform, his cloak shimmering with turquoise and gold. Below him, dozens of women sing soft songs, their voices weaving through the smoke of roasted game and cacao. Servants carry platters of maize cakes, turkey, and steaming stews, while gourds of pulque and cacao circulate among the guests. In the shadows, concubines glance at one another, each measuring her place in the emperor's gaze. The air is heavy with perfume, music, and tension, half feast, half theatre. Now for the fringe fact, some rumours painted Moctezuma as so indulgent that he rotated women nightly, his attendants managing the schedule like bureaucrats of desire. Others whispered that he rarely indulged at all, preferring to let the mystique of his harem build while he maintained distance. This contradiction makes the gossip irresistible. Was he a man of boundless lust or a ruler so controlled that his very restraint became power? The inability to know for certain only fuels the myth. The palace gossip certainly leaned toward the lurid. They whispered about concubines who fought for his attention, about children hidden away to avoid succession disputes, about nights when the emperor called for music so loud it drowned out the sounds from his private chambers. Whether true or not, these stories painted Moctezuma not just as a ruler, but as a figure whose desires could shape the fate of the empire. His bed was imagined as both battlefield and altar, where women and gods alike collided. As you leave the emperor's wing, the whispers seem to follow you like shadows. Some are incredulous, some scandalized, some awestruck. You realize that in the palace of Tenochtitlán, Moctezuma's reputation was as much a performance as his rituals and feasts. Fact and fiction tangled together, creating a legend that has survived for centuries. And perhaps that was his greatest indulgence of all, not his women, but the endless stories they inspired. You step into the final corridors of the palace, where the walls are bare, the torches guttering low, and the whispers take on a mournful tone. Here the stories no longer shimmer with perfume or laughter. They are hushed, heavy with the knowledge of endings. These are the whispers of collapse. of how Spanish conquest and Christian morality stormed through the palace like fire and left nothing untouched. The shocking sexual practices of Aztec royalty, polygamy, concubinage, ritualized unions, and whispered scandals were not merely suppressed, they were dismantled, condemned, and buried beneath layers of European judgment. The historical fact is stark. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors marched into Tenochtitlan in 1519, they encountered a society whose intimacy was bound to politics, ritual, and the divine. To the Spanish, these practices looked like decadence, sin, even proof of devilry. Chroniclers described harems with horror, exaggerated tales of orgies and fertility rituals twisted into obscenities. The Spanish crown and the church moved quickly to stamp out anything that contradicted Christian ideals of monogamous marriage and chastity. Within a generation, the once bustling compounds of wives and concubines were silenced, their women forced into new roles under colonial rule. Here's the quirky detail. Friars didn't just condemn these practices, they tried to replace them with staged Christian marriages, sometimes marrying off multiple former concubines to lesser Spaniards in the bulk ceremonies. Imagine rows of bewildered women, once cloistered in perfumed chambers, now lined up in a church, their fates rewritten in a single afternoon. For the Spanish, it was triumph. For the women, it was whiplash, going from symbols of political power to pawns in a colonial moral order. But scholars debate how much was truly destroyed versus how much was reshaped. Did the palace's practices vanish overnight, or did some traditions linger underground, masked in new forms? Some argue that Nahua poetry, dances, and rituals quietly preserved old ideas of fertility and duality, even as priests preached chastity. Others believe the rupture was nearly total, with Christian morality erasing centuries of nuanced, complex sexual cosmology. The truth is hard to pin down. Colonialism tends to leave more silences than answers. Picture the sensory clash of conquest. Spanish priests in black robes storm through gilded chambers, their censers spilling thick smoke of frankincense over the fading scent of copal. The once bright courtyards, where concubines laughed and midwives cried warshouts, now echo with hymns in Latin. Murals of gods are plastered over with images of saints, their eyes painted stern and cold, the emperor's chambers, once alive with whispers of desire and diplomacy, stand empty, stripped of their meaning. The palace, once a stage for gods and lovers, becomes a ruin of silence. Now for the fringe fact. Some Spanish chroniclers admitted, almost reluctantly, that they had exaggerated the stories of Aztec sexuality. They confessed that the tales of massive harems and orgiastic rites were sometimes inflated to shock European readers and justify conquest. Yet those exaggerations became the dominant narrative, painting Aztec royalty as decadent sinners rather than rulers of a highly structured, symbol-laden society. The irony is sharp. The very practices meant to affirm divine order were recast as chaos, their meanings twisted beyond recognition. The gossip didn't end, of course. Even under Spanish rule, whispers persisted. Indigenous nobles who converted to Christianity were still accused of clinging to old ways. Priests warned of secret fertility rituals still performed in rural villages. The erotic poetry of Nahuatl lingered in fragments, sung quietly by those who remembered. Desire doesn't vanish under conquest. It simply hides, reshapes, survives. As you leave the palace ruins, the air feels colder, the whispers fainter. You realise that the Aztec world of royal sexuality, so structured, so scandalous, so bound to gods and politics, collapsed not because it was fragile, but because another empire decided it was intolerable. The practices that once defined power became forbidden, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to last centuries. Yet the echoes remain. In the poetry, in the myths, in the stubborn survival of stories, you can still hear the heartbeat of that lost world. The whispers of queens, concubines, priests, and captives that still drift through the stones, reminding you that desire is never just private, it shapes empires, fuels rumours, and leaves traces even in ruins. And so here we are, back outside the palace, the torches extinguished, the chambers silent, the last whispers fading into the cool night air. You've walked through the gardens of Tenochtitlan, past the guarded doors, into the smoky courtyards, and you've heard stories of queens, concubines, priests, captives, and emperors. Some of what you heard was truth carved into lore and ritual, some was gossip embroidered by servants, and some was rumour stretched by Spanish pens until it became legend. But together they formed a picture of how power, desire, and the sacred intertwined in ways that can still startle us centuries later. Now let your mind pull back from the vidsome chambers of Moctezuma and his court. Imagine the city as it once was, canals glinting under moonlight, marketplaces humming with life, and the great temple rising like a mountain at the heart of it all. The palace, with all its drama, was only one heartbeat in that vast body, yet its whispers carried farther than its walls, rippling outward until they became history, then myth, and now tonight's bedtime story. There's something strangely comforting in realising that no matter the empire, no matter the gods or the laws, people still whispered the same way about love, jealousy, fear, and forbidden desire. It makes the past feel less like stone and more like sin, warm and familiar. The Aztecs may have wrapped their passions in ritual and cosmic symbolism, but beneath the feathers and obsidian, they were still human, still fragile, still caught in the same tangled threads of wanting and worrying. So take a breath, the journey's over for now. You can let the palace fade back into the mist. The drums and flutes grow quiet. The incense drift away. What remains is just a soft hum, like the sound of water moving through ancient canals, carrying stories downstream. Let it lull you, let it settle you. The whispers of the past have done their work. Rest easy and dream gently.